My name is Maria Elena Duenas, or Male. That's much easier to pronounce. Um, I'm in JustEat Takeaway as a technology manager. I joined not too long ago in August to the design system team. So I'm super excited to be here to share a little bit about my experience. Before joining JustEat, I have worked a bit with web components, both as a user, but also creating a design system using these technologies. So I'm super happy to be here to share a little bit of what I have learned and some suggestions I could have about when and how to use web components. So I just wanted to start by giving you a little overview of what we're building. So our design system in JustEat Takeaway is called Pi. Pi is what we call our design language. So it's an Spanish is coming to my head and not English. Sorry about that. Yeah, it holds all the visual identity, all the visual language, but also all the libraries we use in the company, including design libraries, but also technology libraries. So if you don't know about this, our companies have a merger a couple years ago. So we used to be Takeaway and JustEat from the UK. They merge. And what happens with mergers is that sometimes you get legacy technology coming from both companies. So we have already a couple design systems being used in the company. So we were presented with this challenge on how can we create something, if it has to be something new, or it has to be the previous design systems that we already had in the company. And we decided that that was a great opportunity for us to start using what is called as web components, because our teams in the company use different technologies. So there are teams using React, there are teams using Vue. So instead of having to maintain two different legacy systems at the time, we decided that it could be a good opportunity to start or give it a try. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about those learnings, but I'm also want to give you an introduction of what web components is. So the way I'm going to be doing this is by telling you the story of how web components evolved and how did we get here? And most importantly, why did it take a little bit of time to get here? So before starting, how many of you have heard about web components? Yeah, pretty cool. How many of you use them or have worked with web components? Okay, less people. So let's start with the beginning. What are web components? So web components is a set of technologies that allow you to create components that are actually native to the browsers. So web components is not what we are used to see in the JavaScript ecosystem. It's not a framework. It's not a library that we can use to build components similar to React or Vue or other things. Web components is a native technology built into the browsers. In other words, web components is a way for us to just extend HTML, create our own tags. So that sounds pretty cool. So why is not everybody using this technology right now? We're going to talk a little bit about the evolution of web components and why it has get to this point where we are today a bit slowly. Web components were introduced more than 10 years ago in a conference just as a concept, but nothing else. It was an idea. And in these timelines, I'm going to show you the evolution of web components, but in the bottom one, I'm going to show you what was going on in the industry as well. So by 2013, the first draft of the specification of web components, in this case called custom elements, was released. What is a specification? A specification is only a document that says how technology needs to work, nothing else. So I want to talk a little bit more about this. What is a specification? It was released to the web platform. So as I mentioned before, web components is not a framework. And many of you probably already know this, so I'm going to be very quick about this. But the web platform is a set of technologies, APIs, open standards that are developed by the World Wide Web Consortium and other standardization bodies. So the idea of these technologies that you probably already know a lot of them. For example, HTML, CSS, SVG, is that are agree upon a body of standardization so that they get implemented into browsers. So many of the things, for example, in the early days jQuery, many of those things later got introduced into JavaScript as native. So web components is one of them. This is the reason why it's being a little bit slow. So if you have a framework, there's a community developing that framework, people getting to use it and evolving. It's quite quick. It could be much faster. But when you need the world to align into how these things need to work, it's gonna take longer. So that's one of the reasons why web components has evolved so slowly. What happened next is that during this year, Polymer was released. Polymer was a framework that was supposed to support web components in the meantime that browsers get to support them. So this is a nice graph to illustrate what I'm talking about. If you see the red part, that foundation that Polymer was bringing, it's the API element that needs to be implemented into the browsers so that web components can work natively. So Polymer project, the idea was that they can provide these polyfills for browsers so that people can use web components until these get implemented into browsers. So that happened in 2013. And what happened next in 16 is that the version 1 of custom elements gets released, which is not backwards compatible. It's completely breaking Polymer, and we don't have a way to write web components anymore. We're back to a spec. So just a couple things to note. I'm just noting here when major frameworks were released to see where the industry was heading at the time. So as you know, React was very popular, still very popular, but got very popular at some point, and Vue came out in 2014. Another important development is the inclusion of JavaScript classes in ECMAScript 6, because custom elements version 1 is literally expanding a JavaScript class. So that's how it works. So that was important to note. So in order for web components to be more widely available, we needed them to be supported in browsers. Chrome and Safari got support in 2017, Firefox in 2018, and Edge later in 2020. Internet Explorer never got it. We know it's a common thing. But what are we talking? When we talk about this specification, what features needed to be implemented in the browser for web components to be ready? These three things. So when you see about web components, you're gonna hear a lot about these three pieces of technology: custom elements, Shadow DOM, and HTML templates. I'm not gonna go too deep into this. I'm just gonna do a very quick overview so we know what is this about. Custom elements is basically what I told you before, is a way to extend an HTML element. So you create your own element by extending a JavaScript class. What you would put inside this bracket is your behavior for your component. So here you're gonna be doing all the event handling, you're also gonna be defining the HTML, like the structure of your component. You're gonna be defining where the styles need to be get from. So that's basically custom elements. We have the registry. The registry is an API that lets you then define your components. So as you can see, you will have tag name, and then you pass the class that you just defined. So here you can see clearly I'm creating my own tag. I'm extending HTML. The third technology is something called the Shadow DOM. This is not something new. This is something that already existed as a web technology, and many native elements already use this. But the gist of it is that basically you have a DOM root that is hidden from the main root. Why is this useful? Because this lets you encapsulate things, both styles and also the DOM elements. So from outside of your main DOM, you won't have access to modify or to affect the style of this button. So this is a screenshot of the Google DevTools. So as you can see, there's something called the shadow root. So the button there is inside the shadow root. So basically you can encapsulate the styles and avoid side effects. a big feature about web components. And lastly, templates and slots. You don't need to create a component to create reusable HTML. So templates is a way where you can just define this tag. It will be defined in the DOM, but it's not gonna get rendered. And it's only gonna get rendered when you use it, and you can reuse it. So you can also just have a repetitive HTML by using HTML templates. So what has to happen next for web components to be ready for everybody to use? We need tooling. So web components is easy. It's JavaScript. You don't need any kind of framework to write them. You can go ahead right now and use JavaScript and native technologies to write web components. But who here writes just vanilla JavaScript if you're a developer here? Yeah, really? See, yeah, some of you. For those of you who doesn't, why, why don't you just write vanilla stuff? Probably because it's verbose, probably because it's not easy. It doesn't have a ton of features that frameworks bring, like reactivity, right? There's things that are still missing. And for web components, even though they're native, we still need tooling to get to write them. So I'm gonna talk about these two tools that there are a couple of others, but these are what I will think are the big players. As you can see, they came up early, but they also have had enough time to evolve and learn and make themselves better. And before starting with my comparison of Stencil and Lit, I just want to mention what happened to Polymer. So Polymer didn't necessarily, it did disappear, but they actually decided to take Lit element, and the community behind Polymer decided to support the Lit element project. So Polymer and the community that I started with custom elements went later down the road to develop Lit. So we can say it's some sort of evolution. Polymer stopped working as it was. For a very technical term, it was a two-way data binding framework, and then decided that wasn't the way to go. And one-way data binding was the right way, so that's why this happened. So a quick comparison of what these tools can do. So Stencil and Lit are both tools that will help you make your life easier with web components. Stencil is more known like as a compiler, and it will present you framework more like features, because Stencil was also built as a tool to build web applications. So it's not necessarily built only as a tool to build web components, but applications. So it could be a little bit more complex and heavy. Whereas Lit is more a set of utilities to actually just build components. So it's the thinnest layer you can get to start building web components. Stencil works with JSX. So for those of you familiar with React, it actually looks a lot like React. It has class decorators. So it works with TypeScript because it has decorators, so you cannot not choose to use TypeScript. It comes out of the box. With Lit, you have a templating system that is very similar to the JavaScript templates, but you can have conditionals, you can have loops, you can have directives. So in that sense, I would say both are very similar. But with JSX, you have extra, like the edge class, what you need to render your JSX, you need to transform that. So important difference. The next one, and very important to notice, is that Stencil provides tools for outputting your components. So we're gonna touch upon this topic a little bit later, but not every framework is playing well with web components right now. For example, React doesn't play well out of the box with web components. So you need something called a wrapper for React to work with web components. So Stencil will already provide these generators for React, for Vue, for Angular, for all these tools, whereas Lit is kind of just flat. If you have the team and the capacity to create your own compiler, then Lit is a better option. What's the difference? That the stencil tools can be a black box. So if something goes wrong, if you don't understand why this happens, it's very hard that you will be able to fix it. Whereas if you create your own ways of compiling things and creating your own components, then you have full control. So it is a trade-off, and it depends on what you need. Last one, as you can see, Stencil has a ton of application-like features. So you have virtual DOM, exit rendering, pre-rendering, object as a properties, whereas Lit is lightweight, so you will have definitely, it supports reactive properties. So when you pass a property, like let's say a button type will be a property. Button type could be primary, secondary, or however you want to call it. That is reactive. So whenever the application changes, the component will re-render. So that's what we talk about when it's reactive. What both do is basically they make your life easier and perhaps sometimes harder. So this is not necessarily the fault of the tools. Web components still evolving. So sometimes it can get difficult. Reactivity and property state, it's a feature that both provide. Scope styles and shadow DOM, it's also what we were talking before, right? Of encapsulating your styles. Both of them will let you do that because they support web components. And finally, both claim to be performant, and take this with a grain of salt. We haven't yet been able to test this in my current team, but we want to do that. But both should be performant. Important things to note. Both had good documentation, but the learning curve for Stencil could be a little bit higher because it has more features. Having said this, it's important to understand the support channels. For Lit, it's completely open. You can reach out to the Lit team. We have direct access to the Lit team. They're super friendly and they receive feedback because they want to keep evolving the framework. For Stencil, I haven't used Stencil in more than a year, so this might have changed. But before that, the project was a little bit abandoned. So there were issues, nobody was fixing them, there was little support, and that's the reason why some projects actually migrated from Stencil to Lit. This might have changed. Last year I released that Stencil have released 2 new versions of the tool, so version 3 and version 4. So the team might be active again, so take it with a grain of salt, but this used to be an issue. And finally, you can always switch. So there's use cases about this. If you start with Stencil, it works, it helps you go faster at the beginning, and later down the road, you're ready to build your own tools, then you can switch to Lit. So this has happened. Shoelace is one of the biggest open source web component libraries out there, and they were built like this. They were built with Stencil, and they switched to Lit when they start finding a little bit of problems, but they also have the capacity to build their own tools. So basically, that's the difference. Why is it important to know this? Because if you're going to take a decision of using web components for your design system, you also need to decide what tool you want to use. So I hope that gives you a little bit of perspective. Everything has evolved now. So we are using web components in production. We have success with it. I have used both tools. In my previous project, I used Stencil. In this one, we're using Lit. So I could confidently say we can use them in production, but there are still nuances. So it's good to know that there are issues, but those issues have workarounds. And some of these issues are also being looked by the web components team that will implement native solutions to some of these issues. But just to quickly mention which ones are those. As I mentioned before, React still needs a wrapper. So the wrapper can be an automated bundling building step where you just create a React wrapper for your web component. So it's not like a big deal, but it's still needed. Vue has some issues with what is called the V model. So if you have worked with Vue, the V model is a feature for form elements where you can bind the data that the user is inputting very easily. So sometimes Vue doesn't recognize your form element as form element, so you need workarounds. Multiple registries. Who has worked with micro front ends? Or, yeah, understand what are those? That means that different teams, front end from different teams might be coming to the same place, and two teams could be registering the same element at the same time. So that will create a clash. So this is a feature that should be implemented, but is still in discussion. And what issues come from that clash is something that we're still evaluating, because we will have micro front ends. So we need to understand how to sort those issues. Nesting issues in how native HTML works may break accessibility. So to give you an example, a table in HTML, you have table, body, TD, TR. You need to have that hierarchy. If you have an element in the middle of the hierarchy, then it doesn't know it's a table anymore. It completely breaks. And a web component is basically that wrapper. You have another tag in the middle, so then the DOM doesn't know it's a table anymore. Another example is what a label and an input. A label would use the form attribute to say, I belong to this input. But if you put both in the shadow DOM, they cannot see each other. So that can cause an issue. So it's also something that needs to be fixed, and there's workarounds for this. With ARIA, you can definitely support accessibility, but it's not natively being fixed yet. And finally, be aware that because the web components are in the shadow DOM, some testing libraries actually have issues finding elements. So we recommend using Playwright, because Playwright works very well with the shadow DOM and finding things in the shadow DOM, but some other libraries are yet not prioritizing implementing these features. So why is this a problem? Because we create a button that our teams are gonna use. And then our teams are gonna try to test using that button. And when they want to click it, the testing library is not gonna find the button. And that's a problem. So also has workarounds. But our recommendations is to use Playwright. So just to quickly give my thoughts or my 2 cents, having said all this, having said all the pros and cons of using web components, and after understanding what it would have taken a little while to evolve and why it's still evolving, should you use them? And that's the question. So I will respond with another question. Does your design system need support for more than one framework, or will need to support more than one framework in the future? What are examples of this? What I mentioned before, right? Micro front ends. If you have micro front ends, chances are different teams are gonna be developing in different frameworks. Another example is what we have here in JustEat. We support different parts of the organization. So we support different products. That means teams could be using different technologies. So it makes a lot of sense for us to use web components. We don't have to maintain 2, 3, 4 libraries. Having said this, can your company invest in a dedicated team? So even if you have one framework, implementing web components can future-proof your company so that you can migrate from that framework if you need to in the future. But it will take effort. So unless you have a way to invest that effort, it's preferable probably that you build your design system in the framework your company is using. It's gonna be more straightforward and you're gonna get value quicker. On the other hand, if you don't have a dedicated team, a contribution model, it's gonna mean that your contributors are going to need to learn a new technology. And the learning curve can compete with the time or the small time they already have to contribute to your system. So it might not be a good idea. So ask yourself that question. Finally, are you interested in investing in innovation and state-of-the-art development? Because web components is still evolving. And the ones that are using web components are the ones giving the feedback and shaping how this looks into the future. So web components is a really good opportunity for your company and your team to invest in the community, to invest back and give back into actual web development. So web technologies as we see before. So it could be super interesting if you want to contribute back, also to consider it as an option. Web Components is working for us. We have successfully deployed what we call now the cookie banner. Why the cookie banner? Because our cookie banner has other components. Our cookie banner has toggles, our cookie banner has headings, has buttons, and has a model. So our cookie banner is a complex component that has other components that we could use as first example here at JustEat to test if everything was working. And everything is. Of course, we had issues, the issues I mentioned before, on the way, but we have been able to fix those things. So we have working components in React and Vue. We also support SSR. Important thing to notice and to remember, when you think I'm gonna support React and Vue, for example, it's not that that might not be the only thing you need to support. You need to think about Next, Nux, about SSR, but you also need to think about how bundling tools are gonna work with your components. So it's bigger than you think. So if you want to get agnostic, it's good to think about what agnostic means. So it's not only frameworks, it could be more things. And finally, we already help another team implement a local design system. So what this means is that they have their own version of web components to implement their own snowflakes. So they're components that we're not gonna globally implement for the whole company, but they're still gonna use web components and our repo and our building tools to do this. So it's been looking really good for us. So it's definitely something we can recommend. This is our design system, as I mentioned in the beginning. We're open source. So if you bookmark pi.design, you can get into the documentation side, and from there you can access the GitHub. So if you're interested in seeing how things work from our visual language, but also from our components, because our web components are being published here, you're gonna be able to find that. You're also gonna be able to find ways of reaching out to us. So feel free to reach out if you are going to start exploring or are thinking about exploring web components or using it, or if you have any questions about it, we're super happy to support and to get you connected also with, for example, the lead team or the people that we also have connections with. So yeah, to finish, maybe the next thing that happens is that you get to be part of this story and you implement your own web components and you use this technology for your team. So with that said, thank you so much. I hope this was useful.